Welcome to Vinoche Cottage, the home of Jacob and Charlotte Weaver. They were typical of many 19th century Americans, seeking better opportunity as they moved west. What would make their story remarkable were the detailed letters Jacob wrote. Are the contents of these letters truthful or fanciful embellishment? Join us as we read Between the Lines. In 1812, Jacob Weaver was a 36-year-old farmer residing in Ulster County, New York. On June 18th of that year, the United States declared war on Great Britain. It was the first such declaration in the history of the young republic. The war was a terribly mismanaged affair. To Americans of today, the War of 1812 is hardly remembered at all. But to Americans of 2 centuries ago, it was a very real occurrence with deadly consequences. While the war may have loomed large in the national conscience, Jacob mentions it only briefly in his letters. In February of 1815, he makes mention of an incident which had taken place the previous December. The event he briefly describes literally could have changed the course of American history.
My brother Abraham requested, write about the war, whether any of the men had to be turned out. Well, since peace is made, there's not much need to say much about it. There has been armed men enlisted for the term of 1 year called Rangers. They were sent to the back settlements if it should happen the Indians should break through. This was done so as to keep them coming any further. There was an Indian chief and his squaw someplace on the Wabash River on some business. Well, the wind blew hard and the river was deep, so they could not get over. A captain of the Rangers, as I'm informed, told the chief that he could stay in his house till next morning. At night, there came one of the Rangers and shot through the window and killed the squaw. Since this happened, the Indians came to that place and murdered some of the people.
In order to understand this letter, one must first know what had transpired before.
They will never have recourse to arms unless driven to it by a series of injustice or oppression. Of this they already begin to complain, and I am sorry to say that their complaints are far from being groundless. Governor William Henry Harrison, 1806.
It took an incredible amount of inner strength to move north and west of the Ohio and persevere. The determination and strength of will of the American people of this time and the threats and difficulties they overcome is hard for us to relate to today, but they did. They did persevere, and the Republic held. George Rogers Clark, who in all reality opened the West to that westward migration in 1779, right where we are today, once said, "If a country is not worth protecting, it is not worth claiming." Problem is, as the Americans continued moving west, there was another people already there and believing in the very same things, the native people.
The frontier was a rough place to live. In 1800, they divided up the territory into 2 different territories, with the Northwest Territory being Ohio and the eastern portion of Michigan, and the remainder of that becoming the Indiana Territory. And being a new territory, it obviously needed a capital. The Northwest Ordinance, or the Ordinance of 1787, required that the capital of the territory be located in the center of the population of the territory. Most of the population of the territory was along the Ohio River and the Wabash River, and the only town of any size at that point would have been Vincennes.
Jacob and Charlotte left Ulster County, New York in October of 1813. They arrived at the small town of Vevey in the southeastern corner of Indiana Territory 45 days later. Indian troubles here had ceased, but to the west of them, in the territorial capital of Vincennes, it was a different story.
The town of Vincennes was a mixed town early on. It was French, but it also included Indians that lived in the town with the French, and it was a very cooperative agreement here. They both wanted the same thing. The French were here for furs and for trade, and that benefited the Indians as well. As more Americans moved in, the desire then became for land. The Indians didn't see that quite so favorably, and so those kind of relationships began to break down.
In 1809, Harrison had acquired 3 million acres of land by negotiating the Treaty of Fort Wayne. He was determined to have Indiana join the Union as a state. To do that, he needed a population of at least 60,000. Standing in his way was a Shawnee Indian by the name of Tecumseh.
Tecumseh stated that the land grants and the land treaties that Harrison were making were illegal because he was only dealing with one or two tribes, often tribes that Tecumseh didn't feel had the right to even negotiate on that land. If Harrison wanted to buy land, Tecumseh said he needed to negotiate and make an agreement with all the tribes of the territory, not just one or two.
Tenskwatawa was Tecumseh's brother. He was also known as the Prophet. Both he and Tecumseh had been uniting the tribes in order to resist American expansion. The base of their operations was along the Wabash River at Prophetstown. Traveling by canoe in August of 1810, Tecumseh, along with 400 fully armed and painted warriors, descended the Wabash to meet with Harrison in Vincennes. The sight of those warriors passing below Fort Knox caused great alarm in the town. The meeting took place at Grouseland, Harrison's home. The meeting did not go well, to say the least. After some heated words, Tecumseh's legendary composure failed him. Pistols were cocked. Lieutenant Jesse Jennings of the 7th Infantry brought up his squad with fixed bayonets. One wrong move on anyone's part would bring disaster. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed. By the time the meeting ended the next day, Tecumseh had made it clear to Harrison. While the old boundary line would remain, any new land cessions from the Treaty of Fort Wayne would be met with force. It was only a matter of time before these two men and their cultures would violently collide.
By 1811, the feeling of peace in the area had been changing. There were Indian raids to the north and northwest of New Switzerland, and the colonists here were on high alert. The men still worked in the fields during the day, but at night they would all gather at one person's house for sleep. They posted sentries. They kept this up for quite some time.
Tecumseh would meet with Harrison one more time in July of 1811. While Tecumseh spoke of peace, the information Harrison was getting from his spies told him otherwise. A more hostile attitude was being exhibited. Violent encounters between American settlers and natives were increasing. To complicate matters, the British had been making overtures of support. If open conflict came, they would support the native forces. The territorial capital of Vincennes was weak and poorly defended. It would be a prime target for Indian attack. Knowing Tecumseh was away to the south, Harrison saw his opportunity to break up the Indian Confederacy, protect Vincennes, and carry on with his goal of expansion. He began requesting troops and concentrating them at Fort Knox.
The fort was never fully garrisoned. Probably 20 people here at one time was the average. The commander that was in charge of the fort was very lax, and the soldiers here were considered almost inefficient until a new commander came, Zachary Taylor.
Captain Zachary Taylor has been placed in command. In the short time he has been a commander, he has rendered the garrison defensible. Before his arrival, it resembled anything but a place of defense. Governor William Henry Harrison, 1811.
On September 26th, Harrison's army began the 150-mile march to Prophetstown. A few days earlier, he had received a letter, which read in part,
"You will approach and order him to disperse. If he neglects or refuses to disperse, he will be attacked and compelled to it by the force under your command. Secretary of War William Eustis."
By October 3rd, Harrison and his army had reached a prominent bluff above the Wabash. There, they started construction of a stockaded supply base. It would be called Fort Harrison in his honor. Fort Harrison is the location of what Jacob referenced as a place somewhere along the Wabash.
It was located on the Wabash River, 65 miles north of the territorial capital of Vincennes. William Henry Harrison had chosen this site long before the post was established.
I have reconnoitered the country nearly to the boundary line and have fixed upon this as the most eligible situation for the fort. Governor William Henry Harrison.
Great views up and down the river, great landing spot for boats bringing up supplies from Vincennes. Also, there's a trail that comes up from Vincennes for supply wagons. And right nearby is a Wea village. The Wea were on friendly terms with the United States until bullied and pressured by the pro-Tecumseh anti-United States tribes, such as the Potawatomi and the Wabash Kickapoo.
On October 29th, the Army left Fort Harrison and began its final approach to Prophetstown. Two of the men Jacob would write about were in the ranks: Benjamin Park, a captain of dragoons, and Toussaint Dubois, captain of Harrison's spies and guides. Harrison would call those under Dubois' command men of honor and integrity. Arriving at Prophetstown on November 6th, a clash seemed imminent. However, Harrison agreed to meet the prophet the following day. Moving 1 mile away from the village, he encamped his army on a plateau. With a swamp to his front and a creek to his rear, with sloping ground on the flanks, this was the best ground available. The prophet had been instructed by Tecumseh to avoid conflict and disperse if needed. Tecumseh knew rebuilding his confederacy would have a better chance if it was not defeated in battle. That night, something happened in Prophetstown. Whether Tenskwatawa was convinced of his own mystical power, or he was bullied into an attack by more hot-headed members of the Confederacy, is a matter of conjecture. What is for sure is at approximately 4 a.m. in the cold and drizzling blackness of November 7th, warriors struck Harrison's rectangular camp, first at one angle, and then another, and then another. By the time dawn broke, Harrison had miraculously held his ground. The army would spend that day burying its dead and consolidating their position. That night, each man was at his post. None slept. Throughout the cold and rainy blackness, the watchword, "wide awake," was ordered to be continually communicated around the entire perimeter of the camp, starting with the first man, and then to the next on his left, and then to the next. The whispered words, "wide awake," moved among the silent oaks and falling leaves.
Wide awake.
Wide awake.
Wide awake.
Wide awake.
The next day, Harrison marched into a deserted Prophetstown. He burned it to the ground.
The Battle of Tippecanoe did not end the Indian problems, it just added to it.
After the Battle of Tippecanoe in the spring of 1812, the citizens here in the Wabash Valley were pretty much divided. There were those that felt that the Indians had been defeated and, in fact, the war was over and the Indians were going to behave themselves. But there was another contingent of people that felt that nothing had actually ended, but in fact a long and bloody war had just begun. Vincennes began to prepare for its own defenses. Fear spread through the settlements. There was talk of blood vengeance by the hostile natives in the north for the attack on Prophetstown. And
what Harrison feared most now occurred. Natives who were on the fence, as well as those committed to Tecumseh's now broken Confederacy, went straight into the waiting arms of the British. In September of 1812, Indiana Territory erupted into bloodshed and violence. Fort Wayne, site of the 1809 treaty negotiations, was besieged. At Fort Harrison, Captain Zachary Taylor's small, fever-ridden company of the 7th Infantry was attacked by an overwhelming Indian force. His inspired and victorious defense earned him the brevet rank of major. The day before the attack at Fort Harrison, the fear of blood vengeance became horrifyingly real. 50 miles west of the town of Vevey, at the small community of Pigeon Roost, 24 men, women, children, and an unborn infant were massacred.
And it was a time when life itself was not guaranteed.
Into this world, Jacob Weaver would move his family.